I'm Dustin Small. I run Small Bar Smithy just outside of Craven, Saskatchewan, and I'm a toolmaker.
You know, the very essence of the mental game is this. The only reason an event matters is because we make it matter.
Welcome to the Mullins Farrier Podcast.
Every horse, whatever it was doing, had a season. Once their competition season finished, they took the shoes off, they chucked it out in the field with some other horses, and it had a 2, maybe 3 months period where it went and remembered what being a horse was all about.
Even in a cheaper area, your prices should be set by your skill level, by your experience. And some people might not feel that they're worth, as much as others. But if you're only charging $160 to shoe a horse, then the only way you're making money is on your trims.
The WCB was a way to make sure that you kept the trade alive. I think I'm a custodian of the trade, so it's like we have to keep it going.
It was hard, but you adapt and overcome, and that probably gets to me where I am now. It's problem solving, horseshoeing's problem solving, and back in the day it was problem solving how to be as strong as the older apprentices. So it's all about adapting and overcoming, which was good.
I know we learn every day, but you do have to put yourself outside the box and just continue to learn, which is why I was just trying to do my fellowship, because I still have apprentices, and if I stay at my AW, I'm stagnant.
Welcome, everyone. No shopkeeping for today. This interview comes to you once again from Calgary, Alberta at the World Championship Blacksmiths Competition. And as I'm sure you've already gathered, I collected a lot of great interviews from my short visit there. I came home with a memory card full of them, and this one is no exception. It is unique, however, in that this is the first interview I've done with a blacksmith. And as you will hear, blacksmiths can be just as passionate as we are talking about shoeing horses, discussing the nuances and intricacies of doing what they do with metal. As you will hear, Dustin donated his beautiful wrought iron hammers as the top 10 prizes for the competition. We do a very deep dive into the unique processes that Dustin uses to create these beautiful hammers, and how he tries to stay as stubbornly close to the traditional methods that would have been used way back when. I'm fairly certain that a lot of you traditional shoemakers out there will find yourselves in agreement with many of Dustin's philosophies. For me, his willingness to unselfishly share trade secrets put Dustin in a league with many of the great shoeing mentors that we know of out there. Anyway, I had a great time getting to know this gentleman, and I hope you enjoy the conversation as much as I did. Today's episode is proudly sponsored by Spencer and his team at OutWest Design and Fabrication, where they build farrier bodies, custom interiors, and vet boxes, and just about anything else you can come up with. I have seen many of their finished products and spoken to many of their happy clients. So happy, in fact, that it inspired me to use them for my next project. Check them out on Facebook at OutWest Design and Fabrication. It's kind of interesting. You'll be the first tool maker.
Oh, wow.
I've had other farrier tool makers
Right,
on,
yeah.
but somebody who that is their thing, a unique episode for sure. What brings you out here? So you've traveled quite a ways to come to this competition, and what brings you out here?
For this event specifically, when the WCB and Craig kind of reached out, or I guess put it out there that they were coming back to the Masters here for the World Championships, I'd reached out and I'd done some sponsorship hammers in the past for North 49, and I just felt that it was a good opportunity to kind of get my name out there in these circles and not necessarily specifically blacksmithing circles. So I reached out and sent some pictures of some of the work that I had done, and Craig touched base and said, yeah, if you want to sponsor some hammers, we'd love to have you. So it was one of those things where I kind of banged out 10 hammers for the top 10 here and made my way out. It's a bit of a hike, but it's still in my backyard, right? So you're not going to miss the opportunity to come out and see something like this.
Yeah,
so
no kidding. So, and this is your first experience with the whole WCB trailer. And
yeah. it is something else.
Quite the operation.
It is. And, we were talking this morning, and the logistics and everything that's gone into the trailer itself, outside of the competition or anything else, you look at the number of hours and years it's taken for all the little tricks that they've got with the trailer, and everything has a place, and it's very well thought out. And that's a testament to years and years and years of doing this, right?
Right.
And I wasn't around for those early years, and, hear stories on podcasts all the time about the tent and different things, and not experiencing that. I don't have anything to compare it to, but it's quite the unit to see it out here in person for sure.
No kidding. Now, blacksmithing is an unusual trade to get into. How did you get your start?
Spite.
Really?
Yeah, it was. I get asked this question a lot, and my answer is always the same. And like, I run classes in the shop too, so people always ask, well, you must have this kind of a family thing, and I'm a first generation blacksmith. I didn't come into it that way. And when I first moved back closer to home, that would have been 2014-ish. I was dating a girl, and she had 3 boys, and flipping through the channels one night on the TV, and Forged in Fire comes on. And
I knew you were going to say that.
It was one of those things. I'd worked corrections years ago, and my partner in corrections, we were both into bushcrafting at that time, and knife making is something which is ironic because I'm not a knife maker, nor will I ever be a knife maker now, but it's something that we had talked about. I'd mentioned in passing watching this show that that's something I've always wanted to try, and her middle son was kind of a character, and he kind of said, well, you'd never be able to do that, and I'll show you, right?
Yeah.
So literally the next week we were out at the farm, and I took an old Disker blade and kind of welded up a tube on it, and we used to show purebred cattle, and so I had a cattle blower in the shop there, so I hooked that up for a blower, which was way, way too much for blacksmithing, but fired some charcoal in there, and that is what kind of kicked everything off. And so out of spite grew Small Bar Smithy.
Right. Okay, now to explain a cattle blower, what would that be?
For anybody that's done any pet grooming, or it's like a high power hair dryer.
Right. So you use that to power your. I get you.
Yeah.
Okay.
So not knowing much about the operation of a forge, it was problematic. So, but lessons were learned, and that kind of spiraled into being on the farm in rural Saskatchewan. Lots of neighbors have stuff sitting out in the tree line, so old forges, and so word kind of spread that this is something I was getting into. And a neighbor said, well, I've got an old forge and an anvil you can use. So that it was an old, like a hand pump. It kind of ran a slip gear that powered a leather belt that ran the fan.
Okay.
So it was old as sin, but it worked. So that was kind of the next generation, and things have kind of progressed from there to where the shop is now.
Right. And what do you work out of now?
So right now I've got, my shop is I think it's a 12 by 15. It's in a barn. And so I've kind of annexed a little corner to start out with, and I've got a brick forge. So I run coal, or I guess coke exclusively. I don't have a gas forge or anything like that.
Okay.
And in 2019, I built a nice brick forge that I work out of now. So that's kind of my little space. And then I've got, to do any of my grinding or machining, I've got a larger space it's insulated. It's not heated, but it's insulated. So I work out of that for all my other stuff, welding, fab work, and stuff like that. So it's more than enough space for a one-man operation.
Okay.
I like it nice and cozy. And
yeah.
I always joke that I operate, just about everything I do operates in 6 square feet. So I've got the anvil right close to the forge, and I don't have a power hammer or a press or anything. So everything is done by hand at the anvil. So that 6 square feet is my corner of the world most days.
Okay. Other than the hammers, what are some of the other projects you work on?
That's kind of it right now. That kind of, it takes up most of my time. Like those rod hammers, I'll put, 25 or 30 hours a piece into them, right? And these ones are a little bit different because I was doing a set and kind of working through, taking all 10 through at the same time. So that kind of expedited some of those processes, but a lot of time goes into those hammers. So I don't have a lot of downtime for those passion projects and things like that. So I've got a lot of things on the to-do list that I'd like to get into. Working with wrought, I'd like to make anvils is kind of a longer term goal. So doing some stake anvils and things like that, and some smaller hand forged anvils, but that's kind of down the road.
Right.
I've got a few custom axes on the books as well that I've got to get finished because they've been on the books for quite some time.
Right.
So people are pretty understanding. The guys that are waiting for them they keep bugging me, as they should, but it was one of those things. This year was kind of a unique year in the sense that we had this event. We had the World Heavy Horseshoeing Championships in Brandon that I did hammers for. Last year I did hammers for the North 49 Mentorship Awards, and I'm doing the same this year. So all told, I'll have 23 or 24 sponsorship hammers out there.
Wow.
And so that's kind of monopolized most of my year. And
of course.
I kind of knew that going in, but I don't think I was maybe as realistic with myself about what that would actually entail.
Yeah.
So
It's a lot easier to say yes.
Oh, yeah.
than when you actually have to do it. Yeah.
So it's one of those things where some of these custom orders get off the books here. I've got a few kind of unique hammer projects and anvil projects that I've wanted to get at for a long time. So I'll do some of that, and some of that stuff will be up for grabs, and some of that will just be a for me thing, right?
Okay. Russell, who first pointed you out to me, he said you have a very distinct method of building these hammers. Could you go into that a bit?
I think it's distinctive enough, I guess. It's so most of these hammers, with the exception of the World Clydesdale Championships, I use some anchor chain, wrought iron anchor chain for those. So it was already in a kind of an 1.5 inch round cross section. So they were a bit different to do, but all the rest of my hammers are basically stacked wagon tire, wrought wagon tire. And that's what takes the longest is I'll work each bar down individually, get it into a nice rectangular cross section, clean it, grind it off, stack a couple pieces, forge weld them together, clean them off, stack them, clean them. It's time consuming. And the other thing too, working with wrought is you lose, anywhere from 30 to 50% of your mass through that process, right? So you start out with a lot of material to end up with something that it's like, really, this is all you're going to give me at the end of the day, right?
Right.
So through that process, the wrought does get refined. You're working out a lot of those inclusions and working out a lot of that scale. So you're left with a pretty clean billet. And then when it comes to the faces, I use 1045. I've always gotten along well with 1045. It's pretty forgiving heat treating. And when you have that differential between the wrought and the tool steel, whatever it is that you're using, there is a tendency for that to kind of pull and cool off at different temperatures, right? And I've had a lot of success with the 1045, so I've kind of stuck with it. Everyone kind of has their preferences for hammers. A lot of guys will say 4140, or you get up into those harder steels. And for me, I don't know how many thousands of hours I've got on my wrought hammer at home, but there's no nicks or dings, and I'm pretty hard on it. Right? Not as hard as what a Farrier might be, I guess, maybe, but they hold up pretty well, right? And maybe we can get to it later, but one of the most interesting things is you'll have people reach out and say, I want to get a hammer from you. And right on. Yeah, we can make that happen. And you do up this hammer and do the handles, everything's done by hand at the anvil, and you get it out to them. And of course, they're all heat treated. They're all functional hammers and they're made to work. And I was talking to a friend out in Manitoba, and I said, well, how's the hammer working? He said, okay, just hang on a sec. I'll go get it. He walks from the shop over to the house and then comes back with it, right? And it hasn't seen a day of use in its life. So that's kind of one of the interesting things is, I've got a lot of guys that'll use them, knife makers specifically, because they like some flashy stuff. So a lot of those guys are using them in the shop, but I guess the award hammers are a little bit different because they get them laser engraved. And so they're more of a trophy than a hammer, but they're still functional hammers and they should be out there working, right? That's one of the things, not that it's a pet peeve, but I make them to be used, and I get people's reluctance to do that, but I'd like to see them put to use in the field. So,
well, I mean, it's almost a testament how nice they are,
right? Because I always hear, well, don't make them so pretty. And I'm like, wow, that's just, that's not going to happen.
Funny how that works. So can you describe to me, what's the benefit of doing it that way? When you say wrought, you mean wrought iron.
Yeah.
It's kind of hard to find, is it not?
It's getting harder. We're pretty fortunate, I think, in Western Canada here that there's a lot of old wagon wheels out in the bush.
Okay.
Talking to a lot of the guys in the States, it's problematic for a few different reasons. One is during the war effort in World War II, a lot of that scrap steel went in the bin, for the war effort. So I think that plays a bigger factor in the U.S. in finding a lot of this stuff than it does here.
Okay.
Because we didn't necessarily have that to the same degree because our manufacturing just wasn't up to par with what the U.S. was doing at that time, right? So we won the war, hooray for us. So it didn't cost us anything. And it's good because we still have a lot of that kicking around. The other difference too, and I don't know what the reason is, but it seems that especially wagon hoops, they get a bad reputation as being hard to work and kind of the garbage wrought iron and things like that. And I've come across a few here and there, but I probably processed 3,000 or 4,000 pounds of wrought, and it's one of those things where most of these wheels are pretty good to work with, and they're tricky, and you got to know what you're doing. But they hold up pretty well under the hammer, right? So it's getting to be a more scarce source. But up here, I've been lucky enough that you put the word out, and anytime I think I bought 50 or 60 hoops in one go, a farmer put them on Facebook Marketplace, and I'm like, it was 3 hours away, and I'm like, I will be there tonight to get those.
Right.
So
I need those.
we still have quite a bit kicking around. I think the benefit of doing it that way is I'm able to make that larger cross section. Even with these hammers, I worked out, I think it was a bar 56 inches long by 1.5 inches square. And then I cut the billets out of that.
Okay.
And so I forged it all in one piece. And the advantage is that I can make those bigger cross sections to make hammers. The downside is that it takes a lot of work, right? When you hear guys talking about, I can't find any wrought iron, what they're really saying is I can't find any wrought iron that I can just pick up and make a hammer out of.
Right. Okay.
And I don't begrudge anybody for that, because I like working hard at the anvil, so it doesn't bother me. But I think that's the biggest issue. I've got some wrought iron that came out of an old grain elevator in Elva, Manitoba, and it's 3/4 inch round. So North 49 is actually using that. They're making a Saskatchewan pony roadster for their finals, which is going to be interesting. But there again, it's beautiful wrought iron, but just given its size and small cross section, most guys won't take the time to work that into something that they can build into a hammer or an axe or something like that, right? So the long and short is that there is a finite supply of wrought iron out there, and there's an even scarcer supply of that thicker cross section. But I think if you scrounge enough, you can find a lot of usable stuff. It's just, it comes down to how much coke you want to burn to get it to that final product, right? So
is this a full-time job for you, or is this
I run it like a full-time job.
Yeah.
So my grown-up job day to day is, my background is law enforcement. So I was with the RCMP for years, and I do fraud investigations for the Saskatchewan provincial government now.
Okay.
So medical billing, insurance type stuff is kind of my wheelhouse. It's a pretty good job in the sense that I have that flexibility where I can be at work early by 3:30. If nothing's on fire, I'm out to the farm, in the shop. Forage is going by 4:30, ready to go, and I'll work till 9:30.
Oh,
and
really?
then weekends, it's pretty much a fall 14-hour days out there unless something else is going on. So the long-term goal is to get to a position where I can make that seamless transition into making tools full-time. It's tough to leave that steady paycheck and that, and everything that comes with it, right? That security. But after being at events like this, it's tough to go into the office Monday morning, right? Yeah. The people in this community are salt of the earth. They're amazing. It does have that family atmosphere, right?
Yeah,
so
for sure.
Kind of see that, and everyone's kind of on the same page, and not that everyone's like-minded, but it takes a lot to ruffle feathers here, which I enjoy. And I can't say the same for being in the office.
Right.
There's a lot of things at play there, but I am trying to basically gauge what is that 50, 60 hours a week in the shop look like,
right?
And what'll be my return on those hours, right? And that's where it gets a bit tricky, because you look at the time involved in putting into these hammers. Not that I've painted myself into a corner, but I've kind of built a bit of a niche market in terms of the wrought iron hammers. But I invest a lot of time at this point into making them. So the solution to making that transition is kind of broadening the tools that I'm putting out. And I think a mix of the high-end wrought iron hammers alongside, doing some fullers and different tooling like that.
Okay.
And then some mono steel hammers, things that I can really rattle out fairly quickly and still keep that craftsmanship there. And then really be able to take my time and sinking, a lot of hours into those wrought hammers. And heirloom quality is where I want to be. And we're not there yet, but that's the end game, right?
Right. Yeah, it's tough. So it's quite the trade-off, because you are putting so much time into it. It's really hard to charge what
there's no way
they're worth.
Yeah, there's no way.
Right. And that's why I was wondering, as a full-time job, that you would always be shorting yourself, I guess, in some ways.
Yeah, it's always funny where, there's a lot of full-time smiths here in Saskatchewan, Alberta, a few tool makers out there. And it's one of those things where you almost have to get to that production line work, right? Banging out the jigs and get under a power hammer or a press and really turn stuff out. And whether I've convinced myself of this or whether, I'm being honest with myself about what it looks like, but I see it as my full-time job is basically supplementing my ability to turn out the level of work that I want to turn out,
right,
without taking that financial hit.
Right.
That is the real challenge in balancing that level of craftsmanship versus making it a livelihood, right? And those two are at odds.
Yeah.
And it's the same with anything. It doesn't matter what you're doing, right? It's how much time are you going to invest and be happy with the product you turn out versus what you're charging, right?
Yep. Well, you think of the guys here who they probably hand make a lot of the shoes that they're putting on horses, but it's not that pair that the clients are paying for. I mean, they've made thousands of shoes that are sitting on the shop floor. They'll never get put on a horse, and all that time went into it. They're not getting paid for that.
Oh, absolutely. And that is one of the things. I'd done a post about the hammers here, and one of the things that I said is, I made them by hand at the anvil, and they're going to be earned at the anvil. And I think outside of all the other reasons why I'm kind of drawn to this community and the farrier community is that they're not stepping away at this competition to run something quick under a hammer or press something out. Or if you're working that cross section down, you're doing it the hard way. And even with a striker, there's a lot that goes into that. And for anybody that hasn't seen these teams work, it's next level, right? It's a dance. It really is at the anvil, and there's no shortcuts. You earn every hammer blow and every inch of steel that you move. So for me, I see a value in that, and that's where makes a guy want to double down on doing the things the way that I've been doing them, right? And because I think in these circles, people may not necessarily want to charge what I would have to charge to earn a living at doing that, but I think as things stand now, the guys and girls in this industry see a value in doing it that way. And that's important to me, right?
Yeah.
So not that there's anything wrong with doing it, blacksmithing under a press or a hammer, but it's different. I always get into that debate or argument depending on who it is. But from my perspective, it's not better or worse or traditional or not traditional. I think they're just different. And, for me to be able to say something is hand forged at the anvil, like these hammers, it's hand forged at the anvil, right? just like all these shoes, so.
Well, and it's interesting because I didn't realize that the same thing existed in the blacksmith world, but in the farrier world, you have the hammerheads and you have the grindersmiths.
Yeah.
And these guys will use a hot rasp to grind what they need off, where somebody else will flick on a bell door and away you go.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
It sounds like you just found your tribe crossed over into a different
100%
career, right?
Yeah.
The farriers versus the blacksmiths, but I didn't know that was the same thing in your world.
Oh, absolutely. You could throw a stone and hit a million different discussions on it, right? And there's always the discussion of what's traditional, what does traditional mean? And if a blacksmith had access to a welder 300 years ago, they would use it. Well, of course they would use it. And that's why blacksmiths don't exist anymore, is because they used it, right?
Right, yeah.
And my counter to that has always been, but they didn't. And you look at some of the work that's been turned out historically, it's a testament to that craftsmanship, right? And you'll have the guys saying, well, if you walk into your shop and you turn the lights on and you're not working by candlelight, then you're not a traditional blacksmith. And fair. We've got a lot of luxuries. The fact that I can do the amount of work that I do and have clean drinking water and food on the table and don't have scurvy, there's a lot of things, right? Like I said, for me, it does come back to there's a difference in the tools that you use. And like I said, it isn't a better or worse, because the young man that I learned how to make hammers from is proficient running power hammers. And he's one of the best out there. Ethan Hardy from Hardy Locomotive Works. He's out in Alberta here.
Okay.
And some of the cleanest stuff you'll ever see. And I couldn't do that under his hammers, right? So I take a different approach, and that's kind of how I approach things. You always fall into that trap of better or worse or traditional or not traditional. And no, it's just different.
Right.
I'm a guy that hand forges things at the anvil, you know? So
I think in some ways, like you could hear Craig today, he was talking about how Ford basically killed the blacksmith industry and the farrier industry. And basically the tasks that one single person had to have the knowledge and skill to do were divided up and turned into brainless. You just press a button or do this one motion and away you go. And I often wonder, and I've read several books that kind of touch on it, is that not where a lot of the malaise and depression and stuff comes from? Because you don't have this purpose. You don't have this skill set that you can continuously work on and improve. It's just not there anymore.
Oh, absolutely.
Unless you take a route like you're taking.
Yeah, it's maybe just a me thing, but blacksmiths these days, their affinity for power hammers, and it's like that caused the demise of that
Right.
trade,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And I know I'm overstating that, and I'll probably get messages online for anybody that's listening to this.
Right.
And
Yeah.
that's the reality, is that was the transition from the skilled trade, apprenticeship, journeyman, all those things with all these trades that a lot of them don't exist anymore. And thank God the farrier industry and blacksmiths still exist in some capacity today, but not as they once did. The UK is kind of that, I don't want to say shining light, but in terms of, and I know there's a lot of other European countries that kind of follow the similar path in terms of the apprenticeship programs
Right,
for blacksmithing.
Yeah, the registration.
And I'm probably going to get emails because they're going to
Yep,
be people
there
like,
you go.
no damn way. And so
Yep.
I'm not
Wow,
doing
you're
myself
just
any favors.
digging a bigger
yeah,
hole here.
man. This margarita wasn't a good idea before this podcast. But I think you look at that, and that's something that we don't have here. And I think on the farrier side of things, it's a lot further along than what it will ever be for a blacksmith. I think you have a lot of people calling themselves master blacksmiths, and that's not me calling out anyone. I think the reality is that those programs don't exist. So I don't begrudge anybody for putting a lot of time and a lot of years into honing their craft and taking on that title.
Mm-hmm.
But I think there is something to be said for that formal structure of schooling, peer-reviewed, whatever it is, tasks, tests, however you want to phrase it, right? And Abana is about the closest thing that we have on the blacksmithing side, but that isn't necessarily a trade certification, right? That's more of
What is this?
Artist Blacksmith Association of North America. So they put on a lot of clinics, mostly in the U.S., and they have different projects, different grill projects that you can do that really test like your forge welding and different components, and you've got to make a lot of tools to finish the projects out.
Okay.
It is a good program, and it's a good organization that's really trying to perpetuate the craft, but it isn't a structured, formal, yes, you are an apprentice now, and you've got to put in X number of hours with an accredited smith to obtain the next level, right? And I think that's something that we're missing, and that absolutely does go back to the Industrial Revolution. I guess post-Industrial Revolution, when Ford came online, and that did change the world in a lot of different ways, right?
For sure. The farriers as well. We have people who call themselves, I've met people who have a very low skill set. They call themselves master farriers.
Yeah.
Because we don't have a registration either, or a proper system. And I get there are pros and cons to it for sure. And I've heard both sides of it, and I understand people's hesitancy. I also understand in North America, especially the US, they had that rebel spirit. That's why they got to the US in the first place. They didn't want to be governed by anybody.
Yeah.
And that's why they're here. So I think it would be a harder push to get such a system in. But I don't know. Sometimes you hear in our world, there are often attempts by the vets to actually have control over what we can do.
Yeah.
A complete oversight. And a counter to that would be to have our own system and a proper one. And another thing that you will see at this competition and many competitions is when the British folks come up through that system, they have so much foundational knowledge that we have to seek out on our own to get, and just be lucky enough to find the right people who are going to give it to you, right?
Oh, yeah.
And that often, I think, in a lot of competitions, it gives them an edge.
Yeah.
Like you do see them placing better. And that's just, it's basically being taught from go, a method that works and has worked for hundreds of years, as opposed to sort of floundering around until you find the right system, right?
Oh, for sure. And the challenge becomes is trying to make it a one size fits all, or you've got so many different perceptions, about what should be the fundamentals and
exactly
what things should be the supplementary information or abilities or things like that. So, it is a can of worms, but, I think there is, and that's where the WCB and similar associations are, I think, important in the sense that they are fostering that environment to learn. And it may not be explicitly open your textbooks and here we go, but just putting this out in front of everyone's eyes to see. And there is that camaraderie by and large, you're seeing it. So places like this, organizations like this are important, and they're kind of filling that gap right now. And then of course you've got a host of schools, Canada and in the US, and they range from length, because I've been looking, because this is a road that I need to dip my toes in, right? So, you look around and it's one of those things where well, I could go for 3 weekends or I could go for 6 months.
yeah.
You know, there's a pretty wide gap, and they're all telling me that I'm going to have the tools that I need to be successful.
Yeah.
So I don't know, my spidey sense is tingling a little bit. I think a lot of programs are what they are. And, you know, if you have a bit of that knowledge, you kind of know what you're looking at and what you'll probably get out of it. But yeah, it's tough to say. It's interesting. I spent a lot of years in enforcing the laws, and even now it's what I'm doing, and
Right.
applying provincial legislation and criminal code charges and all those different things. But I'm not going to say I'm not the best guy to do that, because I'm good at what I do. But I always take the approach of, is this too much, or do we really have the authority to do
Right.
these things? And there does need to be those checks and balances, right? As soon as you get a government body overseeing something, you're in for a lot of red tape and a lot of hurdles. And it doesn't matter what it is, whether it's building a fence in a city, you know, give that one a try and see how well it works. So I get the reluctance, and I do understand that. And I think there's merit to that. I think that's why we're seeing these types of associations and the system that we have now is, I think there's a recognition that we need something like that. It's just getting to that point, right?
Right.
On the blacksmith side, it's the Wild West. It's a free-for-all, because there isn't that animal husbandry component to it. So you really are left to your own devices. And I've had a lot of conversations about trying to establish like a toolmakers association, similar to the American Bladesmith Association.
Okay.
So you can actually go and get an accreditation as a, you know, apprentice bladesmith, journeyman bladesmith, master bladesmith. And they are a bit more regimented in the sense that there's certain criteria that you have to meet.
Yeah.
It's peer reviewed.
Yeah.
It's judged. All these different things that add credibility to that system. And as a toolmaker, especially in Canada, there's enough of us out there that are turning out quality tools. And then there's a whole pile, kind of like farriers, eh? Yeah, there's a lot of similarities here.
Yeah.
Where guys will be banging out old loader pins and not really know what kind of steel it is, but they'll bang out a janky looking hammer and throw it on a stick and maybe heat treat it properly, maybe not, but they'll sell it as a hand forged hammer. And
Right.
the issue there is they're not necessarily selling it to guys like me, because we're like, oh, no, not today, Satan.
Yeah.
But for a lot of guys that are starting out that hand forged hammers are the way to go. You don't want to go to PV Mart and pick up a hammer. You know, you should get something hand forged. They see this, the price is right compared to a lot of other prices, and they pull the trigger on it and they've got nothing but problems, right? You know, that the handle isn't fit properly. The handle isn't what it should be in terms of grip, depending on what type of smithing you're doing. There's all kinds of variables there, and there's no industry standard. There's no accountability. And the only people that hurts is the industry as a whole.
Exactly.
Right? So if you get lumped in as, you know, one of those hammer makers from wherever, well, I'm not that guy, but yeah, there's a lot of guys out there, and you hear it all the time. Conversations that I have here, it's the same with farrier work, right?
Yes. Oh yeah.
I think the only difference there is, and maybe not so much, but you know, word spreads pretty quick about those people, but not always, right?
Mhm.
So
Oh yeah, they always seem to have a new client.
right? So it's one of those things where if I could wave my magic wand, I would have some kind of magic formula for some kind of accreditation that I can at least say, hey, my hammers have been peer reviewed by somebody. They've been out in the field. People in the industry use them.
Right.
And this is why they like them. This is why they don't like them. And this is why I can say all these things on my website about how they perform, is because it's objective, right?
Right. Yeah.
I don't know what the solution there is either, but
No.
it'd be nice to have. But taking that on and doing that it would be a pretty big passion project. I think.
No kidding.
And then you're always going to have somebody to say, well, who are you?
Yeah, exactly.
What's your authority,
Yeah.
right?
Yep.
So
Yeah, it's a daunting task.
absolutely, yeah.
Now, something I wanted to ask. So working with wrought iron versus working with, say, mild steel, what are the differences?
It's soft.
Is it?
Yeah. Well, it probably won't ruin any perceptions, but like I'll always post videos of me wailing on these great big billets of wrought iron, right? And people are like, man, that guy's an idiot. But like, give it a try, because it's soft. It's almost like hitting a dead blow hammer. Like when you get it up to welding temperature, I've got enough problems with my body for a lot of other stupid things that I've done in my life, but swinging a hammer really isn't one of them.
Yeah.
It's very easy to forge. It moves very easy when it's hot. Like a lot of these hammers, I'll be able to punch an eye in 2 heats, right?
Okay.
It's moving. It's temperamental to work with. A coke forge is, I think that's why so many people are, you know, maybe quick to say rod is hard to work, because they're doing it in a gas
propane?
forge.
Okay.
And I've tried that. I was at a coke for a hot minute there, and I'm like, okay, I've got an old gas forge. I'll keep trucking. And it was just a nightmare. And I'm like, I know what I'm doing. Like I'm supposed to be the guy. And here I am struggling. And I think that's a big factor. And if you had a really dialed in forced air where, you could really tune how much ambient oxygen was in that environment, then I think you'd have a lot of success.
Okay.
Running a Venturi style burner, it's hard. Like I've tried throwing charcoal in there to try to eat up some of that excess oxygen. And it doesn't seem to have a huge effect, right? So coke, that's the way to go if you want to work rot. Patience, working it hot, and working it hot to the point where you're not seeing that delamination, you're not seeing that fray. And like I always work with the lights off, right? So you can see all the little dark streaks. And as soon as you see that coming, you pack it into itself, hit it with some flux and work it back in. But there'll come a point where you can work rot down to like a dull red, and it's not going to crack and fray like people say it will. And that's just through that refining process, stacking, welding. It'll get to the point where it's a pretty well refined rot that doesn't necessarily have that fragile, or it's hard to describe. Chain leak is a good example. So the wrought iron chain, when you throw it in the fire and you pull it out, it's almost like it's dry. Whereas the wagon wheel, there's so many inclusions in it. People say it's self-fluxing, and it is to a certain extent, but it almost looks wet. When you hit it, throws a lot of sparks, whereas highly refined wrought doesn't, and it has a tendency to crack and split along those inclusion lines, whereas working it down and taking the time to work those billets in and stacking and welding and all those things, it does seem to have a more forgiving grain structure, which is easier to work. It was out of necessity, stacking the billets that way and building the billets out of wagon wheels and doing all those things. But the end result is a higher refined wrought that's still fairly durable and easy to work with, and less problematic.
Yeah.
Right.
Which you don't want as somebody sending tools out into the world.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So it's one of those things where they take a lot of work, but the end result, I've got fewer problems. As long as I'm welding things properly, I've got fewer problems with my end result.
Okay. Now, you learned off of somebody who works mostly with like mono steel stuff, right? So how did you learn this process?
So this was all kind of trial and error.
Really?
So John Williams, he's a farrier blacksmith instructor out of California, and Gilder Works, I think, is his shop name.
Okay.
And he does some beautiful stuff. And I just kind of stumbled across one of his rounding hammers that he had done out of wrought, and I'm like, I got to get me some of that, right? So the first one that I did was a little 1 3/4 crossbeam, and things went well on it. And so I kind of go big or go home, right? So I made the hammer that I still use today. It's a 3 1/4 pound rounding hammer. The fire was lit at that point, right? Where it was nice to work. The end result is beautiful, and it's like Christmas every time, because as you're forging, the scale will show those striations, right? So you get a good idea of what that pattern looks like. You really don't know until you get it cleaned up and take that first etch. And you're like, oh man, if there's a high phosphorus content, then it's going to etch almost like a white or a silver. And some of it will etch quite a bit darker. So by stacking the billet that way, it also gives me the ability to direct that grain pattern.
Right.
Because you'll see on these hammers, it's very linear, right? And it looks deliberate. And I like that.
Yeah.
The chain link, it still has that pattern, but it's just kind of a random pattern, right? And I like things to look a bit more calculated. Like I've done some hammers where I'll actually twist the wrought and try to make like a Turkish twist pattern, like I would be working Damascus.
Okay.
And you'll be able to see those patterns in that wrought iron. And sometimes, just due to the nature of how many times I've got to forge weld it together, it kind of loses that pattern.
Okay.
But if you look close, you can still see that
you're right.
A lot of time and effort went into something that most people will never see at all when they look at it, right? Yep. So that's kind of, the return on investment isn't necessarily there, but I know it's there. So I guess that helps me sleep at night maybe. But you can get pretty deliberate on things. And then Al Shipley, he's in the US somewhere. I want to say he's in Georgia maybe. And he does a lot of wrought work. And he'll actually layer in mild steel, or I think he was layering in some Atlantic, and doing it that way, you're almost making a Damascus, right? So you can stack it and do different things to achieve certain patterns. I've tried pure nickel layers in it. I've got a sledgehammer at home that has wrought and nickel, and then I did kind of a feather pattern in it. So there's lots of things to explore. So when I talk about things that I want to get to in passion projects, that's kind of the, working with wrought, but being very deliberate about what you want it to look like for the end product, right? So in my head, I've got a lot of designs rolling around for stake ambles from, that 20 to maybe 55 pounds where it looks good in my head. And I've got the tools to make it happen. Now, whether it looks the same in the end result, it might be a different story. But I think there's a lot of areas of opportunity in exploring this as a medium in making stuff and making some pretty sexy looking tools and kit.
Right. Cool.
Yeah. The sky's the limit.
Yeah, no kidding. Yeah, just gotta invest that time.
Right. Yeah. Now that's the only thing left to do is everything. You know?
Yeah. That's awesome. Yeah. Do you find there's a different feel to a hammer?
It's tough, right? I don't know how many times I've been asked that today.
Really?
Right? I think there's a bit of a difference. And one of the things that I do too is I'll temper with a drift. So I'll temper from the cheeks out, regardless of whether I'm doing a monosteel hammer or the rod hammers. So the cheeks are always going to be inherently softer, even with a monosteel hammer doing it that way.
Yeah.
I don't know whether I notice a difference per se, because most of my hammers now are wrought in the shop.
Yeah.
So I don't necessarily have that back and forth. I think when it comes to the farrier side of things, I think it would be interesting to turn out some 2-pound rounders and not maybe etch and finish them and give them to guys and say, hey, give me your feedback on how these feel.
Yeah.
And I think there likely would be a bit of a difference.
Yeah.
Especially working things, at that dull red, black temperatures that you see in the farrier world, right? Where, that hammer's doing a lot of ringing off cold steel. And not that that's a bad thing. It's kind of the nature of the beast. But I think there would be something to having those super soft cheeks in there.
Right.
So it's still got the rigidity to hold up to the abuse, but taking some of that shock out of it,
right,
it would be an interesting experiment.
Yeah. So when Russ started telling me about you and your hammers, my first thought was samurai swords, where they have the softer inner core, and then so that there is flex, but it doesn't break, but it's also strong. And so there are all these components to doing it that way.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. Yep. And I immediately pictured that having it set up the way you're doing it, it would have those qualities, right?
Yeah, because it is going to be inherently softer than anything else that's out there, right? So whether you're doing a differential heat treat in terms of heating the faces and quenching, or taking my approach where you're heating from the cheek out, you're still not going to achieve that. I don't want to say malleability, because that's not the right term, but that softness in, let's say, a 1045 or a 4140, even tempered out, that's still going to be far more rigid than what these wrought faces are, right?
Yeah.
So it's one of those things where it's a differential heat treat, but the medium itself is different between the faces and the cheeks, which, is going to give you quite a different result than anything else. So,
right.
I'm sure there's probably science on it out there. I'm sure I'll get emails saying, you're full of it, So it'll be, this will be a good experiment in and of itself to be like, oh, I think this, or I know that. But yeah, it would be interesting to turn out a monosteel hammer and a wrought hammer, grind them the same weight, hang them the same, and say, go nuts with these for 3 or 4 months.
Right.
And
tell me what you feel.
Label them and report back on the difference, right?
Now, I guess for listeners, the terminology cheeks, what component of the hammer is that?
So basically, that's going to be the material, I guess, straddling your handle. Is that a good way to say it?
Sure. Yeah. Insert. That's what she said out here. Yeah.
It's interesting too, because there's so many different hammer styles out there, right? And these ones are quite a bit different than anything that the ones that I've done for the championships here are quite a bit different than anything that I've done before in terms of a hand hammer, right? So that plays a factor too, because these cheeks are incredibly thick. I didn't work them out at all. I basically punched and drifted because I wanted that swell around the cheeks, I guess, laterally versus really pushing them real high, right?
Okay.
It's one of those things where that'll have an impact on how things run too, right? A lot of that stuff is pretty scientific, because you could give the same hammer to 10 different people and get 40 different opinions on it, so a lot of it is subjective. And I've heard a lot of guys, say that there's a big difference. And I don't know whether it's the placebo effect saying, this hammer is going to be magic for you. And, oh yeah, I felt it 100%. Right. Yeah. So good. Well, maybe, so yeah, it's one of those things where, those different styles, I think, will have an impact as well. And typically I turn out fairly traditional looking rounding hammers. more of a blacksmith style historically than the farrier style.
Okay. Yeah.
But I'd like to get into doing some more historic, not reproductions, but there's a lot of old Heller rounding hammers out there that have some pretty nice lines. And originally that's what I had in mind for this competition, but time got the better of me. So this was an alternative that worked for the time that I had. But there's a lot of those historic looking hammers that I think would look pretty good in with a wrought body in them too. So moving forward, I think you'll see a lot more of kind of that farrier focus coming out of the shop than necessarily a traditional blacksmith approach to the style and shape and look of those hammers. And handles is something else entirely.
Well, and that I was going to ask you that, because when you were describing your hammer, so that's a heavier weight than we're typically using in our rounding hammers. Yeah. Is it a thicker handle? That's what I've always seen. When I picture a blacksmith, I picture a really fat handle.
Yeah.
But then I think of how hard I used to use really fat handles on my hammers, because I didn't know you could grind them down to your appropriate size till somebody taught me that. But what a difference it made in how my arm and elbow felt at the end of the day. So do you thin yours down? How does it?
So historically, I've always kind of done the matchbook style handle. So very rectangular, like I'll take it down to a rectangular cross section and then knock those corners off. And that's just the way that Ethan had set them up. And Ethan is kind of from that Brian Brazil style or school of hammer making. So I'd always kind of ran them that way. Like I had my drift fitted so that it was a pretty easy fit. And as time has gone on here, especially running in these circles, it's like, it's just thin and whippy. And these ones are a little bit different because I wanted a bit of a shape to them, right?
Okay.
I wanted some curves and some lines that look good, but they are quite a bit thinner than what I would normally do if I was sending this out to a blacksmith, right?
Right.
I've come to like the thinner whippier hammers as well. So, personally, that's kind of where I've migrated to as well. But handles are tough because I'll hang them how I like them, and I'll laminate. So my standard hammer handle is Purple Heart over hickory. The lamination takes care of any concerns about strength or durability, and they just look sexy, right? The older they get, the kind of deeper and darker that Purple Heart turns.
Okay.
So it does have a bit of life to it too, right? But it's one of those things where I'll hang them and it feels good for me. And I've had one or two guys say, hey, if I get another one, this is what I'd like to see. And some guys are proactive saying, here's what I like.
Right.
And sometimes they'll be like, just trust me. I think this will be
You're going to like this.
Yeah, this will be a good thing for you. I'm good with obliging, right? It's tough because everyone has their own little, even that swell that I put in these, for some guys, that's going to be in all the wrong places, right?
Right.
So when I pick up a hammer, your hand kind of naturally slides to where you want to hang on to that. And so that's where I'll kind of put in those curves and things, but that may be all wrong. And, so that's the risk that you run with anything custom, right? These are a little bit different because nobody's paying for them. So, you can't gripe too much. But, for somebody spending money on a hammer, at the end of the day, you need to turn out something that they're going to want to use and not put on a shelf, first of all. But secondly, it's got to feel comfortable in the hand so that they're confident picking it up, that it's going to work and not having to take it to a grinder and then grinding down those handles.
Yeah.
Garrett did that. Not that I'm calling out Garrett, but I've got to get Garrett a new handle. He'd won one of the North 49 Mentorship Awards last year, and he pulled it out of his bag. And I think we were in Barhead in January. I'm just like, oh man, we got to clean that handle up because he took it down quite a bit, but it's not as smooth as it should be.
Okay.
So we'll remedy that. I'll get him a thinner one, but it's tricky, right? And some guys are pretty particular about weight, and going back to working wrought where you're losing 30-40% of your mass. Well, you've got to overbuild these hammers just so that you're left with enough to work with at the end of the day. But it becomes problematic because that changes the proportions, right? So it's not like you can really pack in a ton of weight into your core billet, your wrought billet, and then weld on your faces. Because if you're making that too long, well, you're going to end up having to upset that a whole pile to get it to that 4-inch length of what I typically want. And as soon as you start doing that, well, then you're losing mass on your faces too. They start to bulge and thin, and you don't get those clean, crisp weld lines, right? And so it is problematic, and I'm getting a little bit better, but each wheel is different. And even sections of a wheel, if it's something that's been repurposed, it may move different. And you'll mark your wheels and be like, okay, yeah, that'll etch this color. And yeah, this one went good. And then you'll pick one up and it goes all the wrong ways. And you're like, well, so much for that,
There we go,
right? Yeah. So it gets tricky where it isn't just a style and a weight that you have to hit, but those proportions, it has to look good, right?
Mhm.
Like it has to be aesthetically pleasing. And that's not the main function of a hammer. It needs to be a workhorse. It needs to work well and be well balanced and all these things. But when we're talking about these hammers specifically, they've got to look good too, right?
Yeah.
Because too many of them are sitting on shelves somewhere not being used. But and it gets tough. And as soon as you start to shave, you get to a hammer and it's just too heavy, and you start to work those things down. Well, your trough lines get a little wider, and all of a sudden you're pushing those faces way further away from the cheeks than maybe what you'd like to see to keep that balance. And
Okay.
so it is kind of a guessing game. And, there's been a lot of times where on these custom order hammers, I'll just miss. It'll be way too light or way too heavy.
Right.
With the heavy hammers, I don't want to grind all that material because all I see is grinding away hours and hours
Right.
of work, right?
Yeah.
I'm getting a bit better at it. There's so many variables with the wrought that it's hard to really dial in
What that end product is going to be.
that end product. Yeah, absolutely. So you overbuild and you try to compensate and you kind of do your checks and balances as you go along. But yeah, it's tough,
Huh.
but worth it, I
Yeah.
guess.
Yeah. I know there's a lot of variables, but I imagine as time goes on, you start to pick up on the nuances of the steel and
What should be a game changer for me is my approach with these is that I wanted to have the same pattern on every hammer. So I basically cut, I think it was 6 lengths of wagon tire, forged it out, stacked them in groups of 2, forge welded them down, and then stacked that group of 3, welded them down. So I basically made, like I said, I think it was a 50-inch billet and cut all the pieces out of that. And I think it was tricky to manhandle because it was like 36 pounds or something stupid, right?
Yeah.
I think in the long run, it was a lot faster doing it that way than my approach of cutting like 5-inch pieces, working those down individually, stacking them, doing it that route. So I think that in terms of kind of those epiphanies that you have, I think that'll be a game changer in terms of speeding my process up and being a little bit more consistent about what that
what it
looks
looks
like.
like.
Yeah,
right?
because as soon as you work the first one, then you're pretty confident that at that point you've welded them enough, you've worked it down enough, it's refined enough that it should act fairly similar across the board, right? You're only left with it's going to take you maybe 4 or 5 heats to weld those faces on versus 8 or 9, depending if something isn't working right. And then that's where you start to get those variables again. But those are easier, I think, to manage than going into chunks of wrought that you have no idea how it's going to work and try to make a few hammers that look the same.
Right, yeah.
Right? There's a lot of different things that you learn over time. And like I'll always say, wrought is kind of a cruel mistress sometimes, but you just have to get familiar with it. Like I said, honestly, the biggest thing is running coke and knowing how to run a good fire. That's why I love it here. Big fires, man. And it's the same in my shop, and everyone will be like, "Oh man, that's a big fire." It's like, well, your fires are too small then, because this
This is what I need.
Yeah, because I'll have 20 pounds of wrought in this fire, so
Right.
this is probably a small fire for what I'm trying to do. I get it. A lot of guys, especially from a hobby perspective, they'll have maybe 5 or 6 bags of coal or coke at home. That's got to last them a while, right? So they're more conservative on how big those fires are going to get. Whereas, I've got a bouncy house blower in the loft of the barn and
Let it rip.
yeah, it's go time, right? And pile it on and pile it high and you get that fire nice and hot. And in the long run, it's probably more efficient doing it that way than, trying to take so long. You sit there staring at the fire to try to get up to that welding heat. To just get after it, get it there. That's probably the biggest thing. And I know, especially these days when we talk about government oversight, it's problematic for anybody living in an urban setting to run forges and there's the insurance questions and all those things. And, that is the one good thing with coke is that you don't have that smoke and stuff, right? So that's one advantage, but they're open fires in the backyard. Even the closest center for me is Regina, and, their bylaws in terms of fire pits. Basically, if you want to have a forge in your backyard, you have to make it a non-functioning forge to meet the requirements because they consider it a fire pit, right? So it's a lot of those, municipal and provincial bylaws that prevent guys from getting out and doing a lot of this stuff. So I can see why gas forges they're just easier for most people, right? But with this medium specifically, it poses challenges, and having fun while forging wrought, I guess it's probably not going to happen for you, right?
Right.
So if you have access to it, the easiest thing to do is look on the marketplace, talk to people. If you got anybody who's got relatives on a farm somewhere, just be like, hey, is there anything sitting out in the bush that I can go take a look at? And rot can be tricky to identify sometimes. And probably the easiest way is to, if you have the ability to cut a piece, the rule of thumb is, 2/3 of the way through, you'll cut it 2/3 of the way through and bend it. And if it bends easy, you should be able to see all those fibers, almost like a cheese string is what it should look like.
Really? Okay.
And that's a telltale, right? There's no question at that point whether it's rot or not. You can look for that patterning on pieces, and sometimes you'll be able to see it. Or if there's delaminations and you can kind of see that wood grain, cheese string grain structure, then that's a good indication as well. But I've had rims where I would swear that they were wrought iron and they're mild steel. So
really?
It's hard. Some people say clean it up a bit, take an etch on it. Even that, sometimes if the piece is really weathered, it's tough to tell. Like wagon hoops especially, if they're really worn down or they're really rust pitted. If it's wrought, it should be in that linear kind of striations that you should see, and it should look like that grain pattern if it's rusting. If it's really pitted, chances are it's mild steel, but not always.
Yeah,
sometimes it surprises you. So the best way, if you have the ability to cut that piece of material and bend it, that's the easiest way to make certain that you're working with wrought.
Okay.
If you're wailing on it with a hammer and it's not moving anywhere, then chances are it's not wrought. It's probably an old, junky, mild steel, right?
Now, and etching, that's putting an acid on it, basically?
Yep. Everyone kind of has their own recipe, right? And that's more so on maybe the knife maker side. So I use 3 parts distilled water, 1 part ferric acid, and 1 part extra strength, like a cleaning vinegar. And that seems to give me pretty nice etch. There's 2 ways you can go about it. You can use, I know a lot of guys have used just vinegar in a crock pot, and you take it up, you warm it up, and that kind of expedites the etching process. But what you're left with is, think of like an old ship anchor that looks really weathered. So you'll get a deeper etch, but you won't get that color contrast that I like to see.
Right.
So ferric is a little bit of the best of both worlds, in the sense that the longer you leave it in, the deeper that etch is going to be, but the ferric is not so aggressive that it's really going to start to eat into that piece. Of course, if you leave it overnight or over the course of a few days, it will, right? But it'll give you enough of that texture. It'll start to distinguish places where the acid will eat things away faster. So like I said, you'll get a little bit of that texture, but you'll also get that color variation too, which is
what you're looking for.
What I'm looking for. Muriatic is nasty stuff. I don't ever recommend using muriatic. If you open it up in the shop, it'll just rust your tools. Like it's nasty stuff to use, right?
Yeah.
Overseas, it seems like there's problems in getting ferric there. So a lot of guys will use muriatic.
Okay.
It'll work similar to ferric, but it'll give you it is a more aggressive etching process. So you'll get that deeper etch faster and more of a monotone. You'll still see a bit of that color variation, but not a whole pile.
It's not as distinct.
Yeah. True North Forge, he's down in Ontario. He makes beautiful stuff, hammers and tools. And he actually did one of the Abana grill projects. So he's a very skilled tool maker and artist blacksmith. And I'm not sure whether he posted them online, but he had done a lot of experiments with exposing wrought to different etching solutions and kind of had them marked out by, I think, 5 or 10 minute increments. So you could actually see on his pieces what that would look like. So if you did X for 15 minutes, here's the ballpark result. So I'm pretty sure he has that up on his page. If not, I'll get him to put it up, because it was a good experiment to kind of show you where things are at, right? Some guys like that real, not rusty looking, but like the real deep weathered etched look. And whereas I like that a bit cleaner, but that I'm looking for that wrought Damascus look almost, right? So you get that color and you can see what's going on in that grain, but not necessarily rough and chewed up a bit. I usually do 3 half-hour to 40-minute cycles.
Okay.
And then the first 2 cycles, I'll use steel wool and just kind of clean it up. So basically what I'm doing there is I'm cleaning that surface off. So you're going to lose a bit of that color on your etch, but you're getting rid of a bit of that oxidization and kind of cleaning it up. And the other thing too is cleaning your eye really well. And like some of these bled a little bit and I don't grind them like polished on the inside. Like I like a little bit of that grittiness in the inside of the eye to kind of
grab it.
Yeah.
Right.
So, I'll put the chamfers on and hang them, but the acid will free up a lot of that and it'll bleed fairly black. So as it runs across kind of the openings of that eye, as you pull it out of the acid, it's going to stain there. So you can see there's a few lines on some of these hammers there where it's just the effect of that etching in so deep that the steel wool wouldn't take it off. Doing steel wool after your first 2 cycles will give you that depth and a bit of that color. By the time you get to the third etch, it should be fairly clean where you're not going to see that. And you're left with a nice, clean, colorful, kind of vibrant look to it.
Okay.
What I do is I'll take it and I neutralize it. So I use baking soda, I think it's soda, and distilled water. So don't use tap water.
Because there's
all kinds of junk in there. And we've got heavy iron at the farm. We've got a well and it's heavy iron. So as soon as you get it out of that acid, it's going to start to oxidize very, very quickly, like minutes. Right?
Really? Okay.
So I go straight from the acid, I neutralize it, and then I do a rinse in just distilled water to get it nice and clean. And then if there's any kind of residual water or even in the eye, I just hit it real quick with an air compressor, just blow off any of that moisture. And then I'll hit it with an oil. I use Odie's oil, but like a linseed will work, even olive oil, just something to coat that surface right away.
So it doesn't oxidize.
Yeah, so it doesn't oxidize. Yeah, you want to coat it with whatever you got on hand. The only caveat I would say is sometimes linseed, if you leave it on there, it'll get almost tacky. Like I use raw linseed oil. If I just want to wipe things down, let it soak for a little bit and then wipe off any excess because it does get gummy and it won't oxidize per se, but it'll leave like a gummy, almost like a stain on the hammer. So you want to get that cleaned off right away. And then from there, honestly, like olive oil, canola oil, anything just you have in the shop that's pretty neutral, lube it up and away you go. If you're a guy like my hammer now, it's got a really nice patina on it. So like it sees, because it's a workhorse, it sees everything. Like it'll fall in the slack tub. Like it's lived a long life. Yeah. But as it not necessarily rusts, but it'll get that patina and you'll start to see those vibrant distinctions in all the different layers and in the grain pattern too, right? So if you're a guy that likes that, then just oil it up so it's not rusting away on you, but just kind of leave it be and it'll develop a character of its own, right? Which is neat. I think it's rod is such I don't want to, there's life to it. And a lot of people will scoff at that, but it is, there's a bit more going on to it. And it does have a personality to it versus just a mono steel hammer, right? So it's one of those things that as you use it and over the course of a few years, you are going to see those changes and there's something to be said for that, I think, right? So
a lot more character to it.
Yeah.
I draw a correlation to musical instruments. Like the longer somebody plays it, it will form to them, even though it doesn't seem it.
Yeah.
But over a long enough period of time, it really does change its character to fit the
absolutely. Like Trigger.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly.
For all you Willie Nelson fans out there.
Exactly. Is there anything else you wanted to touch on?
Hey, you're running the show.
Incredible. Yeah. No, I mean, you shared so much. And yeah, like for anybody willing to try it, like you just given somebody a recipe to give her a shot. And
oh, for sure. And for a long time, like I had done a lot of work with the provincial associations and different things. And I was kind of out there and a bit probably more active, not necessarily doing clinics, but, doing those demos. And, I run a lot of courses in the shop and things like that. And it just kind of got to the point where, it felt like there were a lot of people who have the work was hard, so I quit mentality, where it's, if you don't give me that absolute roadmap and tell me every step of the way, then I'm not going to try it.
Right. Yeah.
For a long time, I was pretty jaded at that because you look at other makers and I know how much time and effort I've put into things and figuring things out.
Right. Yeah. The trial and error.
Yeah. And there's that balance between perpetuating the craft and increasing that knowledge and not necessarily being taken advantage of it because that's not what it is, but people looking for those shortcuts to get further ahead, right?
Yeah.
And for the longest time, I did pull back a bit, but it's one of those things now where if somebody turns out, after listening to this podcast and they go in their shop and they hammer out a rotten hammer, at the anvil doing all these things and they say, here's my hammer, I'd be like, you earned that. Because like, I know what it takes for me to build it that way by hand, right? And if you put in all those hours, you kind of got to tip your hat saying, yeah, like I get it, right? Like one of us,
Yeah.
I would encourage, and I'll always say this, I encourage people to get out there and work with it, but working at the anvil is one of the biggest things that from the blacksmithing side of things, I think is probably underrepresented. You know, you get on some of these Facebook forums and it's like, I want to start bladesmithing. Where can I find a power hammer?
Yeah.
It's like, oh, no. You're going about this all wrong. Get after these things and working with rod, especially for anyone that wants to go out and try it, making a hammer can seem like maybe a daunting task. And, you know, there's some different tools that you need to do it. And I get that. But if you've got a punch and a tapered chunk of steel and a bit of wrought iron, you can turn out a hammer pretty easy. Because like I said, it moves easy. It's very forgiving. So if the hard work or lack of a power hammer or press are the reasons why you're not necessarily turning out hammers, this is a good option. And it's going to be a good lesson in forge welding, and it'll test your ability to stick those faces on and make sure they stay on, right? But at the end of it, it's pretty manageable for one person to do solo. You just got to get after it.
Right.
Yeah.
Cool. How can people find your stuff? What's the best place?
So I'm at Small Bar Smithy on all of the social medias. I think I'll probably not, because I'm old. So there's probably...
You're not on Snapchat?
I'm not on Snapchat and I'm not on TikTok.
Oh, okay.
So don't look for me there. Yeah, Instagram and Facebook are good ways. My website is smallbarsmithy.com. So all of my hammers that I've made, most of the hammers that I've made are on there, and a bit about the shop and kind of a contact me option on there as well. If you're lurking in the Craven, Saskatchewan area and you're interested in seeing the shop, chances are I'm kicking around or I'm in proximity to it that I can get out there. So yeah, touch base if you're traveling through my neck of the woods, and yeah, we'll get out and see the shop. I've got some old equipment out there that's a thing for some guys to check out.
Right.
So yeah, drop me a line.
Cool. Well, thanks for taking the time to do this.
It was an absolute pleasure.
Really appreciate it.
Yeah, you bet.
Cool. And the fireworks are starting. Perfect timing. You know how to end a podcast.
Oh yeah, that's how I do.
Before I let you go, I wanted to say a few words about Fletcher Forge and Tool, a company run and owned by the business guru in our midst, Andrew DeVisser, CJF. Andrew took all of the annoyances we deal with working out of propane forges out in the field and put his engineering mind to improving them. The end result was the FFT 100. Andrew's forge uses a unique burner design, which makes it more efficient, highly tunable, and very easy to access and clean. The biggest selling feature for me, though, is its robust structure. I once had an old farmer say to me, "You can't make a fire in a tin box." He was referring to wood stoves, but those words played over in my mind several times over the years as I watched my sheet metal forge eat itself from the inside out. All you have to do is look at the gauge of steel that Andrew used in the FFT 100 to realize that it is a forge built for durability. Anyway, long story short, these forges are now available in the US at Welshod. They might not be up on the website yet, so call and ask for them by name. It's the Fletcher Forge and Tool FFT 100. You'll be glad that you did. Anyway, until next time, take care of yourselves and each other out there. We'll talk soon.